Before I start with what I wanted to say, since Ciara mentioned also the enterprise, the social enterprise that we work in, which uses cultural heritage as a medium, and we were one of the case studies that Ciara studied and made a number of interviews with us, and so our activities. So we work in an organization called Über den Tellerand, which means in English outside of the box. And the idea is that it focuses on the social aspect of integration and tries to get beyond the helper-helpee dynamic of the integration process and get people together. We say in German, auf Augenhöhe, that is on the same level. And to do that, we bring people together through common activities, and mainly we use food and cooking as a medium of communication. So we organize a lot of cooking activities where people come and express and communicate with the language of food and cooking. And the idea is that this language will transcend traditional language barriers and communication barriers that we usually have. And food then will be a medium for somebody to share their identity, their heritage, grandma's recipe and grandma's story, and will allow for a space where we create a different type of integration and relationships. So that's a little bit. If you have questions about that, after I will answer. So the question that I wanted to address is what is the role of civil society actors within supporting integration within the current legislative and institutional framework, and this will be what I was talking about. The first thing I want to think about is what does this question mean, and what is interesting for me is the idea that we phrase that question as within the legislative and institutional framework. And for those of you who were in the presentations yesterday, there was a lot of critiques of the current framework. There were a lot of presentations that started talking about criminalization of people who save lives at the sea, for example. So civil society actors who engage probably in the first step of even making an integration process possible, which is helping migrants' lives and bringing them over. So, for example, the current framework doesn't allow that anymore. Those people are being criminalized. The borders at the sea where, for example, those organizations can interact with grows smaller and smaller, and by now the sea guards and the Libyan militias are gaining more and more under agreements with the European Union, and therefore the framework doesn't allow for that. Another interesting example yesterday was, I'm forgetting the name of the speaker, so whoever remembers can say. There was a good example of Pikba, which is a refugee camp in Lesbos. Pikba, there was some details about that yesterday, but in the last few weeks, they brought a lawsuit against Pikba, and they want to close it down now under pretense that it has some sanitation issues and so on. It is a grassroots civil society refugee camp that is quite engaged since 6 years now in saving lives, catering for vulnerable communities, and so on. So while it is really important to talk about how we can cooperate within the framework, this question loses a bit of sense if Pikba is going to close down. It is really relevant if it's not being attacked, of how we can cooperate, how we can fund, how we can send volunteers, but still now the framework goes narrower and narrower. And to end with another example to bring that point home, which is the latest master plan suggestion by the Interior Ministry of Germany, which, I mean, the core fundamental of it is that from now on we would like to have certain what is the German word? Anchor, yeah. Pretty much to have the platforms where refugees who come on the peripheries of Germany or in Europe, and we deal with the process of asylum seeking there with kind of a predetermined intention to reject and send back. So this is also agreed upon pretty much by Italians, by Hungary, by Austria, of course. And yeah, if such plans comes into being, I mean, soon we won't have an integration process to worry about. So therefore, I think the most urgent and fundamental question for civil society organizations is how we can actually influence and change the policy framework and the institutional and legal framework into a place where it supports integration in the first place, rather than how we can work within it. So this will be kind of the question that I will address. And I think under that part comes two fundamental questions for civil society, which includes all of us, is what is the policy that we want to achieve? So what is the framework we want to achieve? And then the second part would be how we can push to it, how we can reach actually on the political level and make those policies first a matter of debate, which they are not right now, and then actually influencing policy concretely and changing policy frameworks. I will talk into the first part now and what kind of policy framework we would like to do on a European level. It's quite difficult to explain or to sketch a European policy framework in 15 minutes, or for me alone. I think this should be quite a democratic process that includes the expertise in all sorts of integration aspects, whether it's housing or asylum seeking or legal integration or job market integration and so on. But I think we can sketch some fundamentals and some principles of what an inclusive migration policy framework on a European level can be. And I can think of three principles that should be taken into account here, which would be humanism, solidarity, and respect to international or commitment to international law. Humanism in the sense that any form of policy, any form of engagement within the issue of migration should take into account this principle. This, for example, would rule out a debate that we have right now, which is, for example, should we save lives at the sea or not? Under a principle of humanity, this question is not debatable. Or should we put people in Anken? I keep forgetting the word in English now. Or should we put people in shelters? Yeah, that's the word, on the peripheries and go through the process there and so on. The second principle I would think of is solidarity. And here I would extend solidarity into three levels. The first one is, of course, solidarity to the migrants who are coming. But I think a second level that goes does not get mentioned in the debate is solidarity within Europe, solidarity between European people. This, for example, would rule out the Dublin Agreement. So the idea that we will create sacrifice zones on hotspots and so on. So solidarity means within Europe is the sharing of burdens, the sharing of responsibilities, and from that you would build upon that principle. And I would extend solidarity to a third part, which is solidarity that is beyond Europe, but also to non-migrants. So that would be other host countries, which pretty much are hosting a lot more people than Europe is. That this piece of information also goes missing in the debate, and mainly there are poorer countries with not a lot of resources, and they're actually quite doing quite a good job is not true, but I think they're doing the best they can, and solidarity in terms of local economic development for these societies and support and legal and institutional support would be an important part. And the third principle to stick with, which is the respect to international law, which here would be the Charter for Fundamental Rights for the European Union, so pretty much the laws that we created here, and the Geneva Convention of 1951. And I think those three principles are already completely lost in the debate right now, and going back to such fundamentals would be a good starting point to think of a migration policy framework on a European level. I would add to that two other points that I think are quite important when thinking of migration policy framework. The first one is that it should take into account the root causes of migration. This also is not mentioned in the debate right now. It was 2 years ago a big topic, and politicians were talking a lot about root causes of migration, but then when they acted upon that, apparently the root causes of migration meant the smugglers in the sea and how we can fight them. So when I say root causes of migration, I'm talking about the structural issues that are happening in the third world, starting with war, with conflict, with us selling weapons here, with unfair trade relationships between the European Union and third world countries, which is one of the main reasons for poverty. So certain structural issues that need to extend beyond the migration policy framework. There are other points to be mentioned to that. For example, climate change, which is one of the main reasons for migration, also is not part of the debate right now, which in the next few decades, I think if we think we have a migration crisis right now, that it will be ridiculous in 30 years or so. And to take into account that climate change is probably the responsibility of industrialized countries as well. So there is an ethical point to be done here. There is other reasons to talk about root causes of migration, but these are just examples, but they should be a fundamental part of how we address that, because I mean, we need to actually, if we have a problem with migration, we need to think in terms of the push factors of migration as opposed to the pull factors of migration. There's a certain fetishization here that people are coming because of the pull factors, because of what is attractive here, social welfare state or possibilities of employment and so on. While this definitely plays a role, it's actually quite minimal compared to the push factors of migration: war, poverty, hunger, hopelessness, and so on. Yeah, I think I mentioned there are two fundamentals to take part of. Yeah, so I mean, the second other part of to take into account in the migration policy paper is that it should be inclusive, actually, and it should be part of a bigger policy framework. And what I mean by that is that I do not see Europe as a place that is going through a refugee crisis. There is actually no refugee crisis. There is a European crisis, an economic and social crisis in Europe that, I mean, we have been going through economic bad times for a few decades right now, but there was an explosion in 2010, 5 years before the refugee crisis. And the chronic unemployment, the austerity, the cuts in social welfare, and so on, which is the main issues that Europe is going through, is actually irrespective to what happened in 2015. What happened in 2015 when the boats arrived is that it allowed us a chance for a change of narrative. That means we had the same problems, but instead of discussing the structural issues that we were going through and what solutions might be there, we went through a process of scapegoatism suddenly with the problems. In Greek, for example, is that there are refugees in Greeks. But if you know, like before 2015, Greeks' youth unemployment was already at 50%, general unemployment was 35%, 1 in 10 children at school was hungry, and so on. So when Greek people are angry or have problems, it's actually these issues. The problem is that where do we actually direct this anger and so on. So, and this is really important because with the new right-wing populism that is happening in Europe, its reason, scapegoatism is where it's going, but the reason why people are angry are actually other structural socio-economic reasons. And if we want to deal with that, it's not only to create communication and contact and try to support people to get together and to understand that maybe migrants are not there to go for your jobs, for example. The problem is that the other people on the other side do not have jobs in the first place. So this goes back to the principle of solidarity between European people. So, to go back a little bit, I said there are 2 points. One is what kind of political framework do we need, and then the second point is how we can push that political framework. So that would be the second point. We need political problems, need political solutions, and the fundamental question for the social solidarity economy or the civil society actors now is how to first draw such a policy framework, but then how do we push it? And political organization is the way to do that, how to reach out to politics, how to reach out, first of all, to between each other in a horizontal framework. There's a lot of really interesting organization happening within each nation state, but the fundamental question is how do we extend that between the different nation states, which is also happening. And then how do we, after a horizontal organization, how do we actually have kind of a vertical political organization to our policy framework? Therefore, how do we reach politics? How can the debate that is happening right now, for example, not be pushed by those forces of fear and right-wing populism, rather by civil society organizations that we are all part of? We are actually many, and I think we are, in terms of popular opinion, a lot more than the popular opinion that is being now interpreted and manifesting in the politics we're seeing. To talk about how political organization can happen, I can think of 2 interesting examples. What's been happening in the last few weeks in Germany with the Seebrücken movement. This is quite an inspiring movement that was not created, actually was formed rather organically through many different collectives. By now, 2 weeks ago, there was a demonstration in Berlin of more than 15,000 or so. 3 weeks ago in München, 25,000. in more than 12 cities in Germany. I mean, there was a momentum that took over the country in terms of expression that the politics that is happening right now is not representative of the people. So the question now is, how do you build upon that? I take from that another example to see how we can build upon that, and I think a really interesting experiment that is happening in Europe right now is a transnational political coalition called European Spring. I like the name because it takes the name out of the Arab Spring where I come from, and this is a coalition of many progressive political forces around Europe that are actually now building such a migration policy framework that is inclusive, but that is also accompanied by an economic framework for Europe and a constitution for Europe, and is thinking in terms of, if we want to change politics in Europe, we are presented with a really interesting opportunity coming up, which is the elections in May of 2015 of the European Parliament. So I think civil society in a really, really fast way would have a really interesting part or opportunity in 8 months. And the fundamental question that we have right now is, how do we build in those 8 months in terms of forming policy and reaching politically to the platform, the European Parliament, which is quite a limited platform in all honesty, but it's a good platform for communication and transnational organization. I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from audience?
Thank you. Thank you, Hameed. And you spoke about some of the geopolitical, structural systems that's behind what's causing the migrations. And a word that I was sensitive to, and I don't know if it was purposely or not, was when you mentioned third world countries, because we are experiencing many proxy wars throughout this part of the world. And so to the original meaning of third world, meaning Russian allied or Soviet allied versus more American allied countries, are you thinking that perhaps it's maybe just the countries that are outside of those alliances that are maybe experiencing more of it? Or are we seeing, like what America did to Libya, or Russia is now doing against the civilians and Syrians, are we seeing this spread more into the second worlds or other allied countries?
I mean, I can just tell you what I mean by third world, and then you can tell me the question. I mean it in the most academic sense that it is. I mean, in development economics, first world refers to pretty much the G20 countries. The second world, which is no more, which used to refer to the Soviet Union and the allied countries to the Soviet Union, and third world was pretty much everybody else. And when I see now third worlds, I pretty much think of the economic indicators that will put a country into a third world. So its GDP level, its unemployment, and so on, which would include pretty much the countries that are where migrants are leaving, sub-Saharan Africa, or all of Africa for that matter, the Middle East, and soon Greece.
So then looking at that, at the context, and as we're seeing, I mean, maybe just looking at a negative picture of it, more spreading of migration because it's just becoming uninhabitable in many countries. What then future are you then seeing in this sort of dystopian reasons for migration?
What future I'm hoping for before which future I'm seeing is that actually we come up with migration policies that deal with the root causes of migration. So what we need is actually local economic development to the countries where migrants are leaving, creating employment, investment, a public sector that can support people with a social welfare state, and so on. What future I'm seeing is that this is a political process that is quite difficult to achieve, and it will take a lot of organization and effort and commitment. And I mean, the possible future is that, I mean, there are some estimations that in 100 years, if we do not change our mode of production, sea levels will increase by 2 meters. And all we need is, for example, 1 meter for organized human life as it is right now to be impossible anymore. So this is actually the future that I'm seeing is probably going to happen. But yeah, I mean, I think we are a generation that is facing the most fundamental question that any generation has ever faced, which is, will human life in the organized form that it is still be possible in 100 years, pretty much? And the answer to that needs pretty much to stop climate change process, and we need to think about capitalism here. Yeah.
Any other questions?
You can also ask questions about cultural heritage and the organization I'm working with.
Ladies first.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, civil society in Berlin is quite active, engaged, and progressive. So the organization that we are working with, which actually is in Berlin, but we have like groups of 30 volunteers who do these encounter cooking activities to bring people together in Germany. The situation is still as inspiring in some sense as it was since day one, which started in 2013 and beyond. One can say Lynn is pretty much our community manager and the manager of the volunteers in the organization. For example, one time she mentioned that in 2015 she would get like 20 emails a week of people who want to engage and support and ask what they can do. Now, for example, we get 2-3 emails every 1 or 2 weeks. So I'm just mentioning what kind of criteria we can look at, but this can be, for example, a way to say that people are not engaged or interested anymore. But I think also the sense of urgency that we had in 2015 is not there anymore. So I'm not sure that such a big change in number is reflective of engagement in society. In a really general terms, like beyond the experience of the organization, one can say that there has been a radical shift since 2015 until now, from the welcoming culture to the AfD being in parliament. I mean, there is a big change, and it's going still to negative territories unless we probably organize in the way that I was thinking. Yeah, so funding is still there, for example, so public organizations are still quite supportive from a financial sense, from an operative sense, and so on. Let's see after, for example, changes in the Interior Ministry in Germany, how funding will start looking in the next few years. I'm actually was thinking about that. That was my question to the spokesperson of the LAF yesterday. He avoided answering.
One more question.
All right. Your own suggestions regarding stemming the tide of right-wing philosophies towards migration, the notion that migrants are hazardous to what we call the polity and economy.
The notion that the migrant is what?
Migrants, the influx of migrants, proliferations of migrants in the European nations, is hazardous to Europe, their jobs and opportunities, because there is this political notion, and that is what the right wings are using, and to win political apathy, especially in European countries. So how do we, in your own suggestion, how do we stem the tide of these right-wing philosophies that migrants are really dangerous in European nations?
I believe, like I mentioned, that the problem is that what's happening to migrants is scapegoatism. And when I say scapegoatism, that means there are already problems that these people are facing, and now they are reflecting and interpreting that migrants who are coming are taking my job, are taking my social welfare, and so on. But the actual problem is that they are losing their jobs and they are losing their social welfare, irrespective of migrants coming or not. And if we want to stem right-wing populism, actually what we need to do is not to actually talk about this conflict that is, or the confrontation that is happening between two groups. We should actually talk about the disenfranchised people, I mean right-wing people, populists who are voting now AfD or Le Pen and so on. They are the first victims of the economic and structural issues that have been having in the EU. And I think this is what I meant, that solidarity needs to be extended to the other. So instead of starting to throw stones on each other and thinking that somebody is a racist, we need to understand that they are actually having real fundamental problems, and it's manifesting in racism. So what they think, how they're interpreting the problem is the wrong way. So we need, if we need to engage with that, it should be through dialogue and communication, as opposed to wear a sticker that says fuck AfD. And yeah, and I mean, so a migration policy should extend into the real economic issues that they're going through.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for saying fuck. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your speech, and thank you our audience for the questions.